Hey guys, welcome to my world history lecture. Today we will be going over World War One. Last time we went over the causes of World War One, so we are going to be continuing that unit. But today we will be talking about the actual war. We're not going to finish the war just yet. We'll do that next week. But today we will be talking about the war on the home front, which refers to the U.S. And we will also be talking about the war abroad, which obviously means all of the battles going on internationally. So before we get into the topic of today, let's do a quick recap of the two sides of the war so we kind of know what we're talking about. When talking about the Allied forces, you primarily think of these three countries: Great Britain, Russia, and France. We also have Serbia and Belgium fighting on the side of the Allies, and we talked about last time how Belgium used to be a neutral country, but after Germany used Belgium as just a passageway to get to France, Belgium got mad at that and they wouldn't really take that anymore, so they decided to declare war on Germany and become a belligerent nation. Then we have the Central Powers, which primarily include Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And we see Bulgaria fighting on this side as well. Something quick to note, Italy was supposed to be part of the Central Powers, but they ended up joining the Allies, and we will be talking about Italy a bit later. And to put the war in a broader context, Germany has a lot of control over the central part of Europe, just off how they're geographically located. If you would look at a map, then you'd see that Germany is kind of in the center of all of these countries, and that gives them a huge advantage because they get to control a lot of where the supplies go because so many supply lines go through Central Europe. So with Germany's position, they definitely do have an advantage in controlling these supply lines. So let's talk about the war on the home front. And like I said, the home front refers to the reaction to the war in the U.S. and what the people in the U.S. were doing. So let's first start off with the concept of total war. Total war is when all of society's resources were used for the war effort. This means that all of the citizens in the United States, they were heavily encouraged to take part in the war, whether it be actually serving or just doing little things at home that would help the soldiers out. And in doing so, this led to the government kind of taking control of people's lives. And this was very controversial because, democracy and the United States government was built around the principles of democracy and people's rights. But as the war becomes nearer and nearer, the government starts taking away these rights, and that becomes a concern to people. And this isn't something that only happens during World War I. This is something we saw a lot during any time of crises or any wartime in the U.S. We saw this in the Civil War where Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. We will later see it in World War II with court cases such as Korematsu v. U.S. or Schenck v. U.S. that limit the rights of the people, and we see it here in World War I where the rights of the people are limited in order to best support the war. Another concept we could talk about is the next bullet here, war of attrition, and that means that World War I is no longer a war of the older strategies that we saw in other American wars, such as the Civil War. These strategies that they imposed back then were very outdated to the 20th century because, we just talked about the Industrial Revolution a few weeks ago, and with this industrialized time period, we're dealing with much deadlier weapons. And now it's really become a contest to see which country can lose the most soldiers and most resources, and that would be the victor. And so in a way, even if you do win the war, you don't really come out as being 100% victorious, because even though you won the war, you probably lost a lot of battles, first of all, and you definitely lost a lot of men, a lot of resources, and spent a lot of money. So even if you win the war, because it is this war of attrition, it's honestly not even that good. The next thing we'll talk about is the idea of rationing. And so what happened was, in order to best support the war effort, new controls occurred that resulted in changing the industry and the economy. So factories would shift their production into producing military equipment rather than luxury equipment. For example, you might have a clothing company, and they might have a factory that normally produces goods for luxury clothing such as dresses or suits. However, during this wartime period, factories were urged to produce military clothing such as uniforms or gear for the nurses rather than the luxury equipment to best support the war. And that is in line with the total war we were talking about, where everyone was encouraged to be part of the war effort. And we also have civilians conserving food and other goods. We saw this, or we will later see this, during like the Great Depression, and we definitely do see it again in World War I, where civilians are urged to use up less food and even donate food to the military. And they were also encouraged to raise their own crops through farming rather than going to the supermarket going to the market, and those market goods would be reserved for the people in the war. Next thing we want to talk about is propaganda. And propaganda, to kind of define it, would be information used to influence one's opinion and garner support for something. And in this case, it would be to garner support for the war effort. So propaganda can include things such as posters, pamphlets, or articles that urge people to volunteer. So if you were to just walk in the streets of whatever city that you were living in, you would definitely see all sorts of propaganda that was like, you need to support the war. It was just pretty much advertisements to urge you to volunteer, urge you to ration, and whatever it took to better support the war effort. And not only did these pamphlets urge people to support the war, but it also made the enemy look really bad. So an example is, you might see Germany portrayed as some kind of evil sea monster. And so anyone walking down the streets of whatever city, they'd see, oh, Germany is this, Austria-Hungary is this, and that would raise anti-German sentiments against all these people. And it was especially bad because the German immigrants that were living in the U.S., they would definitely be on the wrong end of the hate that they would receive. And propaganda was also considered to be kind of controversial because it definitely guilted people into joining, and the information on there wasn't entirely accurate. It was meant to be exaggerated to best support the effort. Then we have the role of women during the war. So women were expected to do all of the work that men had done, and this is because, in the northern factories or whatever, many of the men who worked in the factories, they were going off to war, and because they were doing so, women were now expected to fill the workforce, fill the gap that the men had left behind. And that was a huge shift from what they were dealing with before, which was, they that was a huge shift from their domestic life where they would just be working at home, taking care of their children, and now they're working at factories to make supplies for the war effort. And some even served in the war, and although they didn't have combat roles, they served as nurses and were also shipped to the front lines to help out the soldiers. And this heavily transformed the view of women, and women were starting to be seen as, being able to take care of themselves, and not only themselves, but also be able to take care of an enemy. And another interesting side effect of the World War was women clothing began to shorten up and this was because the extra cloth was now being used for the war. And again, this is in line with the idea of total war, about how everything is used to support the war effort. And this definitely helped earn women the right to vote. To put it in context, World War I ended in 1918, and the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, which eventually gave women the right to vote, that was passed in, I believe, 1920. So there were obviously other things that affected women being able to get the right to vote, but the World War was definitely a huge part of it. And just another interesting tidbit, in Russia, there was an all-female military unit called the Battalion of Death, so we definitely see women being involved in the war. And the last thing I just want to mention is the battles. And the battles were mostly fought on the eastern and western fronts in Europe. And it was mostly fought in the western front because Russia was unable to hold as well as France or Great Britain were. So the Allies lose more of the east than the west. But anyway, let's get on to the battles. And we will start with the battles on the Western Front. Let's first begin with the Battle of the Frontiers. This happens in August of 1914 between France and Germany, and the Battle of the Frontiers actually refers to multiple battles. It consisted of 5 battles in total, and in this battle, the Germans used the Schlieffen Plan, which we talked about last time, and the French used Plan 17. And Plan 17 was an offensive plan, and it was to go right for the French lands that were conquered from them and try to take it back. And a little story here, the French get to the city of Mulhouse, and with very little effort they win because the Germans weren't there yet, and so the city wasn't really reinforced with any military support. But during their little celebration, because they thought that they won, the Germans arrive and they end up destroying them, and the French lose the Battle of the Frontiers. Then we have the Battle of the Marne, and this happened in September 1914. Again, Germany uses the Schlieffen Plan, and they think that they can just march into France, but this doesn't really happen, and what ends up happening is Germany gets halted, and therefore trench warfare ensues. And Germany was actually pretty close to France and attaining Paris, but they were stopped. And there were 250,000 casualties each on both the German and French sides. So a very bloody battle, obviously. And just to be clear, I will be using the word casualties a lot in the rest of the video. And just know that casualties does not only refer to deaths, but also any kind of injuries or those soldiers that went MIA, missing in action. And like I said, now let's talk about the Italian front a little bit. So we were talking about in the beginning of the video how Italy was not on anyone's side, but the British actually wanted Italy to join in the Allies in hopes of tipping the war effort. And unfortunately, Italy is kind of irrelevant. They don't really, even if they weren't there, they probably wouldn't have done anything for the war. Their effect was pretty much inconsequential. But regardless, Italy joins the Allies through the London Pact, and they do this because they were promised land from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So in the Italian front, we see a series of back and forth battles, and we see that very little progress was really made. So the first battle we will talk about is in South Tyrol, and these battles were fought on glaciers, and many soldiers were lost due to avalanches. So yeah, these soldiers didn't even die because of, they were serving their country or they were fighting their enemy. They really just died because of terrain, and that's just one example of how pretty much inconsequential the Italian front was. And then we have the Battle of Caporetto, and in here, this occurs in October 1915, and the Italians are defeated in this area and are forced to retreat. They're forced to retreat Caporetto, and I mean, there were 750,000 casualties on both sides, and very little progress was made. So again, the Italian front was pretty much just a series of back and forth battles without much progress, unfortunately. Then we're going to be talking about the Battle of Verdun. This is probably the most recognizable battle from World War I, and it is definitely the most longest and most catastrophic battle of the war. It starts all the way back in February 1916, and Germany attacks the French city of Verdun. And one of the reasons why this battle was so catastrophic was because both the German side and the French side used poison gas. So we do see introduction of chemical warfare. And the Battle of Verdun was so important. Both sides needed to win so badly, which is why it went on for so long. And because the Battle of Verdun was commonly seen to be the turning point in the Western Front, meaning that whichever side won this battle would most likely pick up enough momentum and enough land to be able to win the entire war. And we talked about how the Battle of Verdun began in February 1916, but it lasts until December 18th of 1916, which is 10 months, but Germany never captures Verdun, and it ends up being a French victory. Next, we have the Battle of the Somme, which occurs right in the middle of the Battle of Verdun. We talked about how the Battle of Verdun started in February 1916, ended in December, and the Battle of the Somme begins in July. So, July 1916 is when it starts, and the British are the one to attack, and they attack Somme, which is a river, to pull Germany away from Verdun to kind of help the French out a little bit. And there were 140,000 British casualties and 160,000 German casualties in this battle. And the battle itself lasted 4.5 months, so definitely another longer battle here. The final battle of the Western Front we will talk about for today is the Third Battle of the Ypres. Ypres is in Belgium and was a disaster for the British. So the Ypres land that we're referring to is pretty much a swamp. It was very muddy, very rainy, and because of such poor terrain, 1 out of 4 soldiers died here. And the death rate was so high because in any normal area, if someone were to experience a non-fatal gunshot wound, say to the leg, then they could easily be treated by the hundreds of nurses they have around. But if they were to experience such gunshot wounds here, because the land was so muddy, they would drown in the mud, and that is what caused the really high death rate. So moving on to the Eastern Front, like we said, the Eastern Front wasn't as significant as the Western Front. This is mainly because Russia just really couldn't handle the magnitude of the German army. But anyway, we'll talk about it. The first battle we want to talk about is the Battle of Tannenberg. This occurs in August 1914, so we're kind of backtracking a little bit, and it was just a complete victory for the Germans. They successfully stopped the Russian invasion of East Prussia, and Russia suffered 90,000 casualties, and because it was such a humiliating defeat, the the Russia commander general, his name was General Samsonov, he killed himself because he would rather not face the Tsar because it was such an embarrassing loss. And again, that just really puts into the ground that it was a total victory for the Germans. And to make matters worse, we have the Battle of Masurian Lakes, where the Germans kept Russia out of East Prussia yet again. And for the second time, the Germans win, and the Russians, after that, are not able to go into their own territory anymore. So the last section that we want to talk about is the battles around the world. So this doesn't really pertain to a specific front like the other battles, but this is a bit more global, and it all happens in the European continent, of course, but in the sense it's not really in either fronts. First, we have the Gallipoli campaign. You may have heard of it, and this occurred in 1916, and to give context, the Ottoman Empire joined with the Germans and the Austrian-Hungarians to control the Dardanelles, which was the water route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And it was heavily fortified. The Turks definitely had a good hold of it. And in the spring of 1916, the Russians needed supplies, so the British tried to get those supplies by going through the heavily fortified Gallipoli Peninsula. And when the British arrived, the Turks had a much higher ground, and therefore they were able to shoot at the British, so the British gave up, and it was a loss for the Allies. Next, we'll talk about the Armenian Genocide. Again, you may have heard of it, but it also has been kept on the low, so maybe you're learning about this for the first time today. And the Armenian Genocide took place in the Ottoman Empire, and it was a horrific event, and the Armenians were taken over by the Ottomans, so the Armenians are pretty much scattered all over in the Ottoman Empire. And the Armenian community thrived under the empire, even though they had to pay the jizya tax. And the jizya tax was pretty much the tax that Christians or any non-Muslims had to pay to the Ottoman Empire if they did not want to convert. And because the Armenian population was Christian, they had to pay the jizya tax to the Muslim Ottoman Empire. But even with the jizya tax, the Armenians actually were pretty well off because they were now better educated, they worked really hard, and they became wealthier. And the Turks, they resented the Armenians for their success. They were thinking, oh, why should they have all of this success when, we're the ones that really conquered them? So the Turks were worried during the wartime that the Armenians were working with the Russians since they were both Christians. And the genocide didn't come out of nowhere. Tensions were already pretty high between the Turks and the Armenians. In the late 19th century, there were pogroms, which are pretty much religious wars, and it was just a massacre of a religious group against the Armenians. So the genocide begins in 1914, and it starts the way the Holocaust starts. First, the intellectuals are arrested, and then they are executed. Then they collect the guns of the Armenian men. Then the Armenian men are taken away, and the excuse is that they're fighting in the war, but they're just executed. Then the ordinary men are forced to walk in the scorching sun in a desert until they drop dead. And they had death marches and hired convicts that would shoot them if they would just stop moving. And they would do horrific things to the Armenian population. They would crucify them in some sick irony that, Jesus Christ was crucified, so they're going to get crucified as well. And they would kidnap the Armenian children and convert them into Muslim as well. All in all, 1.5 million Armenians were killed, and at the end of the genocide, only 300,000 Armenians were left in the entirety of the Ottoman Empire, which spans multiple countries. And to this day, the Turkish people do not acknowledge the Armenian genocide, and they blame it on war. They say that it was all just part of the war. Other countries were doing just as horrible things to us. It wasn't a genocide. That's what they're saying now. And the US actually very recently called it the Armenian genocide for the very first time, and the Turks got angry that the US acknowledged that it was a genocide, and the Turks say that, oh, the Turkish were just as much of a victim in the World War as well. So again, it was definitely a horrible time, and Hitler later uses this genocide as a prototype for his own Holocaust. And Hitler was inspired by the Armenian genocide because it was proof for him that he could pretty much eliminate an entire religious group without any consequences, because he could just, wipe all of that out of the records. And last thing I want to touch on is some other fighting. We have the Japanese attacking German lands in Asia, and we have colonial soldiers coming from all over the world to fight. And these soldiers, they stem from, the Indians coming to fight on the Western Front, and we have Africans fighting on both sides, and that really solidifies that it truly was a world war. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. If you guys have any questions right now, you could type it in the chat and I'll answer it. And if not, then you could always email me on that email address that you see if you have any questions or suggestions. But other than that, just please like the video, subscribe, share the word that this channel exists, because we are providing free content for you guys during this time. And if no one else has any other questions, then thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next week on Monday.